This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 839 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the trends this week, I want to send another reminder about the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. I know the season's getting closer to the finish line, but the Patreon has an awesome Discord community. There's rest of season rankings and tiers, weekly rankings and tiers, and more. And if you just want something like playoff schedule rankings by team and by position, you can join the $5 a month tier to get the weekly data dump. That information's in there. And that can be a month-to-month thing. So check it all out by heading to lateround.com. From weeks 1 to 8, Josh Jacobs was averaging a target share per game of 17.4%. Over his last 3, which are 3 with Antonio Pierce as head coach, that target share per game has fallen to 3.5%. That's a super significant change. Now, is this noise? Well, there was also a quarterback change when Pierce took over. It wasn't just the coaching change. Aiden O'Connell has started those 3 games. Jacobs did see a really healthy target share earlier in the season when O'Connell got that start against the Chargers, but there's definitely some fear here this is a quarterback tendency thing. Now, the good news is that Jacobs is running a very similar number of routes. As a result, I do expect to see better target share numbers moving forward. But because there are a couple of factors at play here, the coaching change, the quarterback change, we have to downgrade Jacobs at least a little bit compared to his workload to start the season. Travis Etienne has now averaged 7.7 PPR points per game over his last 2. During his 4 games prior to this 2-game stretch, he was averaging 27.1 PPR points per game. Now, this is obviously a small sample size thing, but I also think it speaks to something I talked to Ben Gretsch about on last week's Perspectives episode. According to PFF's expected fantasy points model, Etienne actually ranks 12th this season in expected points per game. He's outperformed that mark by 2.5 points per contest. He's definitely playing above expectation. Now, I'm not overly concerned about Etienne moving forward, just to be clear. His route participation has dropped a little bit over the last couple of weeks, and they've used Dearness Johnson a little bit more, but they've also had some really weird game scripts. To me, he's still a strong RB1 rest of season. When you watch the Vikings, if you saw them in week 11, it was evident that Ty Chandler has more burst than Alexander Mattison. And that showed up statistically too. Madison had a 33% success rate against the Broncos, Ty Chandler, 70%. Madison played 64% of Minnesota's snaps, while Chandler was at 30%. That's a problem. And even though Chandler had more targets, Madison ran 19 routes against the Broncos, Chandler only had 5 routes run. Madison was used a lot more than Ty Chandler, but Ty Chandler definitely looked better. This is a classic case where you should just be rostering who you think the more talented running back is. In my opinion, I think Ty Chandler still presents a little bit more upside. I think that he's the better back per touch. But Madison's still fine to have rostered, let's be honest. If they give him a lot of work, they have a favorable schedule, he can still be usable in fantasy football. The biggest thing about Justin Fields' return this past week was the fact that he ran the ball 18 freaking times. That's the most that any quarterback has run in a single game this season, and it's the most that we've seen from a quarterback since Justin Fields hit 18 rush attempts last November. Now, 14 of those 18 rushes, according to PFF, were designed runs. If the Bears are going to use him that way rest of season, he's going to be a locked-in QB1. And keep in mind that Chicago has a pretty favorable rest of season schedule according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. Dawson Knox has now been out for 4 games. In those 4 games, Dalton Kincaid has ranked no worse than tight end 7 in weekly PPR scoring. He's averaged a 25% target share per game rate. He's averaged over 15 PPR points per game. He's actually been a tight end 7 or better in 5 straight games. I'm just pointing out the games without Knox. Now, Dawson Knox is not ready to return yet, but even when he's ready, I have a hard time believing that the Bills are just going to revert back to what they were doing before Knox's injury. Kincaid is running a route on significantly more dropbacks these days. That's why we're seeing better numbers. To me, he's a top 5 tight end rest of season. Now, I didn't have this as a transaction this week because I'm not sure how sustainable it is, but I'll at least call it out right here. Justin Watson was something I mentioned on last week's Sleeper Show. I'm happy about that call because he was pretty good in fantasy, all things considered, versus expectation. Watson has now seen target shares of 18% and 28% over his last 2 games. His route participation, it hasn't been ideal because the Chiefs like to rotate their wide receivers. But he did run the most routes at wide receiver for them on Monday night. If you want to throw a dart his way, be my guest. He's been seeing work. He has Patrick Mahomes throwing him the ball. My hesitation is that clearly something needs to change with this Kansas City offense. And Watson's also faced a couple of favorable matchups. But Justin Watson's been operating as the Chiefs' number 1 wide receiver. I can't believe that I'm saying that in week 12 of the 2023 season. Calvin Ridley now has 3 top 10 performances on the season. In his other 7 games, his highest finish in weekly PPR scoring is wide receiver 28. Okay, no big deal. Ridley's hit or miss at wide receiver, right? Well, in those 3 games where he's performed really well, those are 3 of 4 games when Zay Jones has been active for the Jags. Is this just a coincidence? I don't think totally. Zay Jones is an actual decent starting wide receiver. Like, he can play on the outside far better than any backup wide receiver that Jacksonville has. So his presence can open things up for Calvin Ridley and get him moving around the formation a little bit more. And more importantly, it can get Calvin Ridley running more favorable routes. You can look at his route tree from week 11 and see that. Now, do I think these splits are totally sustainable? Is Calvin Ridley some wide receiver 1 with Zay Jones rest of season? No, I don't think that's the case. I mean, the difference between Ridley with and without Zay Jones is just way too dramatic to simply say that it's all Zay Jones. It's still a small sample size thing, and matchups come into play here as well. But I don't think it's simply noise. It should at least make you feel a little bit better about Ridley moving forward as long as Jones is able to stay on the field. I saw a lot of tweets last week saying that Sam Howell was the QB3 in fantasy football. And I just have to say that we have to normalize points per game. Howell hasn't had his bye yet. He's played an extra game compared to his competition, or at least a lot of his competition. When looking at points per game last week, he was more of a low-end QB1. And as it currently sits, Howell's the QB5 in total fantasy points scored. But if you look at quarterbacks with 8 or more games played, he's the QB11 in points per game. Now, he's had a great season in fantasy, don't get me wrong. I've brought this up before, though. He's had a pretty easy schedule. According to my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers, only Carolina quarterbacks, which is kind of crazy, only Carolina quarterbacks have faced an easier schedule this year than Washington quarterbacks have. Howell, when you adjust for strength of opponent, is more like the QB14 in fantasy, which is still great. The only problem is that Washington has arguably the toughest quarterback schedule in the fantasy playoffs because they get the Rams, then the Jets, and then the 49ers in weeks 15, 16, and 17. Speaking of the Commanders, let's talk about Brian Robinson, who's probably having the quietest fringe RB1 season in fantasy football history. Robinson played without Antonio Gibson last week, and his receiving usage changed. Not a surprise. He ended up seeing a 21.4% target share. According to Fantasy Life's awesome utilization report, which again, you can look at yourself for free at fantasylife.com. But according to that utilization report, Robinson played 90% of the long down and distance snaps, and he played 86% of Washington's 2-minute snaps this past week. Those were by far season highs. It wasn't even close. So this just goes to show how important of a factor Antonio Gibson is for Robinson's ceiling. With Gibson active, Robinson's more of a touchdown-reliant player who can break a big play to really hit that ceiling. But without Gibson, that ceiling is a lot more achievable. Let's end today's show by talking about the Steelers because the Steelers no longer have Matt Canada coordinating their offense. People are rightfully excited about Jaylen Warren in fantasy after his back-to-back top 10 performances. He's actually had 3 top 15 PPR performances in a row. The problem is that his peripherals really haven't changed that much at all. He's still in that 40 to 50% snap share range. He's still in that 10 to 18% target share range, and he's still seeing 40 to 48% of the team's running back rushes. I don't think that's going to necessarily change without Matt Canada. The most probable outcome here is that things stay relatively the same. But there's at least some hope now, because Jaylen Warren has absolutely been better than Najee Harris this year for a second straight season. Warren's success rate right now is 12 percentage points higher than Najee Harris's. His expected points added per carry is 0.25 points better. That's absolutely crazy. His rushing yards over expected per carry, it's 2.1. Najee Harris, 0.1. Rational coaching would put Jaylen Warren on the field more. So let's hope this change in coordinator forces more rational coaching. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Check out the Instagram account, @LateRoundFF. And check out the YouTube channel as well, youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later today with the Weekly Sleeper Show.